All right, Ryan, what's on your radar?
So the House of Representatives is often compared to a high school, and it's frankly a useful metaphor. Both have hierarchies that are at once defined and undefined. There are official positions like captain of the varsity basketball team or chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, but there are also social hierarchies that can't be found in any record books. Who's cool and who's not, who has genuine power and who doesn't. Now, for new members of Congress, one of the rites of passage is freshman year hazing at the hands of more senior members. These rituals all have layers of different purposes, and how a member handles their hazing can influence the relationships they have going forward. So Josh Gottheimer reported to Congress after winning a 2016 election to represent a wealthy district south of Wall Street, and the ribbing at the weekly New Jersey delegation meetings began immediately. Yet 5 years later, the hazing hasn't stopped. Members of the delegation simply can't bring themselves to stop giving Gottheimer a hard time. Whether it's Representative Albio Cirez putting a stopwatch on his phone whenever Gottheimer arrives to time how long it will take him to leave, never very long, or Representatives Bill Pascrell or Don Norcross mocking him for barely being a Democrat, the hazing has gone on for 5 years. The reason is simple. Gottheimer's colleagues simply don't like him. And that would be trivial gossip of concern to nobody outside a congressional cafeteria if it wasn't having a real-world effect right now on the prospect of the Biden administration enacting both its bipartisan infrastructure plan and the accompanying $550 billion in infrastructure spending. Gottheimer and 8 of his colleagues have been facing off with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, insisting that she bring the bipartisan package for a vote, quote, immediately, rather than holding it back as leverage to pass the bigger piece. Gottheimer says he worries the larger legislation will mean painful tax hikes on corporations and the wealthy. During a House Democratic leadership call on Sunday night, Pelosi mocked Gottheimer's effort as, quote, amateur hour, pledging to push ahead despite his threats to stop the legislation. Pelosi is not known for miscounting votes, which suggests that she is confident that enough of Gottheimer's 9 will not stick with him. She is known to work the phones relentlessly, and she leaves little to chance. In some respects, Democrats lucked out in the identity of the lead member of what's been dubbed the Suicide Squad. Had the effort been organized by somebody less despised internally than Gottheimer, it may have gained more traction. Quote, Josh Gottheimer continues his perfect streak of being the absolute worst member of the House Democratic Caucus, one member of Gottheimer's business-friendly New Democratic Coalition told me yesterday. Quote, a more likable member could do more damage, but the fact so many of my colleagues, and across the ideological spectrum, mind you, consider him such a douchebag really does limit his influence, unquote. A few years ago, I wrote about Gottheimer's mistreatment of his own staff, which had already become legendary on Capitol Hill. One of the anecdotes ended with him repeatedly punching the rooftop of a staffer's car in Teaneck, New Jersey, and we've produced a dramatic reenactment of it. After that story was published, I was told that a meeting of his colleagues became dedicated entirely to their own reenactments of the scene. Now, had Gottheimer been able to rally 20 or 30 people to his side against Biden, Pelosi, and the Progressive Caucus, he'd present a bigger threat. But his effort has also been stunted by its tardiness, Democrats in Congress told me. Quote, he was late to the game and is having a hard time realizing CPC leadership outsmarted him, said one senior member of the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We whipped early and had Dem leadership on board with our strategy like 5 months ago. The makeup of Gottheimer's 8 other renegades does not augur well for his rebellion. Pelosi can afford to lose 3 votes and still get to the 217 she needs, assuming every Republican votes no. There are 3 vacancies, 2 in Democratic seats and 1 Republican seat. Shontel Brown actually won't be seated until November, thanks to scheduling done by the state's Republican governor. The seat is only open because Biden named Marcia Fudge to be Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The 8 that Gottheimer was able to cobble together for his letter are these. Freshman Carolyn Bordeaux of suburban Georgia, Jared Golden from a Trump district in Maine, Ed Case from a deep blue district in Hawaii, Jim Costa from the Central Valley in California, Kurt Schrader from the Central Coast of Oregon, and Filemon Vela, Vicente Gonzalez, and Henry Cuellar, who represent adjacent districts in Texas along the southern border with Mexico. The letter reads, With the livelihoods of hardworking Americans at stake, we simply can't afford months of unnecessary delays and risk squandering this once-in-a-century bipartisan infrastructure package. It's time to get shovels in the ground and people to work. We will not consider voting for a budget resolution until the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act passes the House and is signed into law, unquote. So assuming Gottheimer himself holds firm and votes no, his most likely ally of that bunch is Schrader, a veteran blue dog who often bucks the party. That's two. But beyond those two, the list doesn't include any members who Pelosi would have a hard time swaying her direction. Whether it's reminding Costa and Schrader that redistricting is coming to their Democratic-controlled states, or reminding Cuellar that she campaigned and fundraised for him when he faced a challenge from Justice Democrat Jessica Cisneros last cycle. Cisneros is running again, and Vela and Gonzalez will also need Pelosi's fundraising largesse this cycle as they face difficult races in redistricted Texas. Case would be crushed in a primary for tanking Biden's agenda. And he's known to be highly concerned about climate change. So despite his penchant for deficit hysteria, he's not a threat to the bill. And the idea that a freshman, Bordeaux, would stare down Pelosi is hard to imagine, especially since Representative Lucy McBath from the neighboring suburban district is strongly backing both bills. Now, Golden has shown independence, and Pelosi is likely to give him a pass, meaning she won't object to his no vote, knowing she has the votes she needs, and she knows that he believes that distinguishing himself from Democrats in the general election is beneficial to him, and he's probably not wrong. Quote, the dynamic of Congress is different, and moderates aren't really doing as well as they were under Trump and the Republican Senate, said the senior CPC member. Quote, Schumer, Pelosi, and Biden are finding their agenda isn't far from the CPC agenda, and it's an easier partnership than with moderates, unquote. So in 2010, Pelosi managed to win a majority for a climate change bill and for the Affordable Care Act, both of which were considered by swing district Democrats to be political losers. Those who voted yes did so not because they thought there was political advantage for them, but because the window for action was closing and party loyalty won out. This time, though, vulnerable Democrats think that there could, in fact, be political upside in delivering on Biden's agenda, the climate money, the child tax credit, universal pre-K, along with some potential downside, namely getting blasted for inflation. The problem for Gottheimer is that Pelosi really wants to pass this reconciliation bill. If Democrats lose the House, she's likely to retire, so this could be it for her. Obamacare is a wounded legacy item. But Pelosi has long considered herself a champion of children and spent years fighting for CHIP, the Children's Health Insurance Program. If she can add to that legacy by cutting child poverty in half, she'd love to do it. On Sunday night, she told Democratic leaders, quote, for the first time, America's children have leverage. I will not surrender that leverage, unquote. Attacks about inflation are coming in the midterms regardless of what Democrats do. So their plan is a novel one in American politics. Actually deliver something and then run on it. And don't worry what Josh Gottheimer might think about it. So, Alyssa, I'm curious for your take because you worked for years for the Freedom Caucus, which made its bones by using its small numbers to vote as a bloc to challenge Republican leadership and try to push the body that direction. As you're watching the Democratic infighting and Democratic calculus going on, how do you think that progressives are handling it so far?
Well, first off, fascinating take, Ryan. So this did bring back a lot of memories from the Freedom Caucus era, and I actually agree with that Congressional Progressive Caucus source who said, listen, when Democrats have everything, we have the House, the Senate, and the White House, the Gottheimers, the moderate wing, just does not have the same power. And this was a lesson we learned with the Freedom Caucus. When Obama was in office and we had the House, we were able to kind of pull together enough people to force Boehner's hand because things were on our side to be able to do that. But right now, there's just no incentive for Pelosi to cave to the moderates. The one question, I've mentioned this before on the show, is I think if the calculation is right that Pelosi is thinking about legacy and planning to retire if she loses the House, then she is going to align herself with progressives and get the best, most progressive policy through that she can. However, if she's thinking about really putting up a fight and trying to keep seats in the midterms, she's got to cater to some of these moderates. Those are the districts that are up. Those are what we call majority maker districts. So I'm curious to see which direction she goes, but I think your analysis is very, very interesting, and we're going to see it play out over the next couple of months.
I think she would rather take the legacy. And I think she would be okay with, I mean, you know, Congress is going to flip from Republican to Democrat, back and forth, back and forth. And I think she would rather have that legacy walking away, and that, you know, Nancy Pelosi did this amazing thing, sort of like Paul Ryan's tax cuts. You know, that I think is what she's really going to actually go for, and say, well, if it goes back to Republican control, I suppose it's okay because we do have a Democrat in the White House. It would have been more disastrous, I think, for her with Trump still in the White House. So one thing, though, that Ryan, you know, you're bringing up in this whole thing that's sort of, you know, it's just those of us that are outside of the Beltway have never been there. I mean, I've only visited Washington, D.C. twice in my life. You know, it's disheartening to find out that this is how it works. This isn't how we think it's supposed to work. This isn't this isn't democracy in our minds. That it all boils down to basically threats and leverage.
Yeah, I mean, history shouldn't hinge on the weird personalities of individual people who the system just kind of, you know, shot into office, whether it's, you know, Sinema over in the Senate or Gottheimer. You know, these flukes of history then wind up playing out.
But you could argue the other side of it too, though, that certain committees are so greatly empowered to hold on to power and leverage. They stack certain ones so that they box out any new blood, that they don't get the level of, you know, it took AOC, I think she's on her third term, to actually be a real powerful member by building her own national brand and finally getting on financial services. But I'd say the decks are actually stacked against newcomers and outsiders by the elites within the House of Representatives.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's right. Be interesting to see how this goes.
Yep, we'll be watching.
Looking forward to seeing what's on your radar next, Alyssa.